All right, let's break down the Charlie Olives versus Beneil Dariush fight. This fight's been meaning to happen for a long time. I think Charles had to pull out. And then what we saw at the weigh-ins was how drained both of them looked, surprisingly. We've always seen Charles Oliveira looking absolutely terrible, like he's about to die before he weighs in. And I'm not sure how Dariush usually looks, but this one, he looked absolutely drained. Dariush looked like he was going to die up there. People were circulating the wedding ring photo where you saw all this space around his wedding ring. So I don't know, I haven't looked too much into Dariush's previous weigh-ins, but to me, that was not a good sign going into this fight. Obviously, both look like they were going to die, but Charlie Olives always looks like he's going to die before a fight. So he's accustomed to that skeleton weigh-in appearance. But we go out. I'm not going to talk too much about the striking. All I will say is it did look like Oliveira had the upper hand on the feet. But let's talk about the grappling exchanges. So to be a fan of Charles Oliveira is a very traumatic experience every time he fights. He goes from getting dropped to getting reversed in grappling exchanges to almost knocking the guy out to almost submitting the guy. These things happen every fight. If you have high blood pressure, I'd recommend taking your blood pressure medication before watching Oliveira fight. This one was probably the least traumatic if you're a fan of Charles Oliveira, because the best thing Dariush really did was reverse a takedown and spend some time on top. But Oliveira, I would say there's two ways to play bottom game in MMA if you're looking to get back up. The most common one is turn to turtle, expose your back, learn how to defend back takes and wrestle up. You might get put in a front headlock, they might throw in a single hook, but ultimately it is a lower risk way to get back to the feet, and a lower risk way than you think, and it also requires a whole lot less experience than the alternative. The alternative is what Charles Oliveira does from bottom position. I say these are the two ways to get back to the feet because he's just so aggressive and he attacks non-stop from bottom. He basically never stops moving. He might reset to a closed guard position, but he uses that so that every time his opponent stands back up, he throws in a deep De La Riva hook or he grabs both ankles, he looks off balance, he throws up kicks. He really uses that bottom game to either get the guy on top off balance, in which he moves away from Oliveira's guard, or he threatens a sweep to get back up. But I would say, given those are the two styles of bottom game that are effective at getting back up in MMA, what Charles does obviously takes probably well over 10 years of jiu-jitsu experience to be able to become efficient in those movements without strikes, let alone with strikes. But I will say Dariush did do a good job on top of negating some of Oliveira's bottom game attacks. The problem is once Oliveira begins this offensive cycle, it takes so long as you sort of dodge and block one attack to the other to get your own attack going. And we saw Dariush was ultimately able to use some Toreando style positions and even try to enter into a knee cut ground and pound position. But every time he would do it, Oliveira would take a scoop grip and threaten a deep half guard, just like he did against Islam Makhachev. That scoop grip's very effective. He's used that in multiple of his fights. You saw he use it in this fight to enter a reap position where he attacked Dariush's legs. Dariush, obviously being a great grappler himself, was able to negate that attack, but it's actually something that he's tried to set up against Islam Makhachev, but Islam was very wise to it, and it resulted in Islam backing up and conceding and allowing Oliveira to come back to the feet. But in this situation, Dariush, not as fearful of Oliveira's pure submission game, stayed in the pocket, ended up being reaped out of the deep half guard position, something I have to give a shout out to Gary Tonin. He would do, you watch a lot of his EBI matches, he would use this entry quite regularly back in the day. He uses this entry to secure a reap. He grabs an Achilles grip, ultimately does a inside pummel where he basically threatens a backside 50, but at no point does he actually roll to the backside 50-50 position, again being made famous by Ryan Hall, Lachlan Giles. I think he had that opportunity there to invert through the legs and roll to a backside, potentially expose the heel hook. Not sure how effective it would have been ultimately against Dariush. I think his heel hook defense is excellent. I have trained with him myself, great grappler. But what you saw was, although Dariush was on top, it was just Oliveira attacking, ultimately getting back to the feet, rocking Dariush. And then we saw Dariush sort of take a head outside shot in which Oliveira was able to stuff it and turn to a turtle position and start throwing some strikes. This is where Dariush's game, this is part of his game that really impressed me, impressed everyone when he faced Gamrot. His ability to do a forward roll or basically like a victor's roll back to the legs. But at this point, it was really too little too late. Like you saw, he took an overhook to attempt a Granby out of turtle, like an overhook on Oliveira's legs. He is very comfortable from turtle, but again, he was very rocked at this time and he really wasn't able to make anything happen here. But again, I would love to see this fight again one day. Who knows what will ever happen. I'd love to see how more of these grappling exchanges played out as those rounds progressed, because I do really believe Dariush's grappling was effective on top. He was just stuck in Oliveira's offensive cycle as he was sort of shutting down one attack, shutting down another attack before attempting attacks of his own. But yeah, massive win to Oliveira. No doubt puts him in a great position to challenge Islam Makhachev again. And I think that's now he has finishes over everyone in the top 5, obviously except Islam Makhachev. The Oliveira fight versus Volkanovski would be something very cool to see too. I have a lot of faith in Volkanovski's grappling. I think he'd do very well on the ground and obviously on the feet with Oliveira. Who knows, that fight might happen one day when Volks defends his title against Yair, and if Oliveira can beat Islam Makhachev, maybe if they fight in September, if obviously that's not Volkanovski versus Islam Makhachev. But yeah, very impressive performance. I felt there was a lot of pressure on Oliveira coming back into this one. He was the champ, he got finished, a lot of pressure to come back and put in a very good performance, which he did against Dariush. Another shout I want to give watching the card was Mike Malott, Canadian MMA fighter, fighting in front of his home crowd. He was able to use a high wrist variation of guillotine that ultimately led to him finishing the guillotine from mount. He was passing off, switching grips, but it was so deep at that point, his opponent tapped before he really consolidated the mounted guillotine. But he did something called a high wrist guillotine. First time I ever saw this was Nate Diaz. And Nate Diaz would be one of those guys that he would always go chin strap, go super deep, elbow below the throat, basically the center of the throat there, and he would either finish around the armpit, which is the sort of the grip Mike Malott had, or you'd see Nate Diaz quite often take out the overhook and grab and turn it into a really, really high wrist variation of guillotine. Yeah, but this is super impressive. This is the best style of guillotine out there. It's the most effective because it's I believe it's the quickest to finish and requires the least amount of strength. You often see arming guillotines, guys just really squeezing. You'll see guys quite jacked that are good and effective at that guillotine. And in MMA, it is a high risk move because you do have to bend the neck to finish an arming guillotine. And if you can't, and if you go for that instead of stuffing a takedown, you probably lost the round at that point. You're probably going to be held down for the rest of it if they pop their head out. Again, most people that go for a guillotine in MMA, instead of defending the takedown, definitely lose that round. If not, I believe the stats show they lose the fight. But the high wrist is such a scary, fast submission that it's much more effective. And I believe the success rate of it is something that we've yet to see in MMA, but obviously Mike Malott demonstrated how effective that was here. And the reason I like it so much is because when you go for a high wrist, guys won't be able to fight out of it as easily from top position. They'll quite often they'll have to roll. And either that means we scramble back to our feet or we end up in top position, whereas oftentimes in guillotine, you either get it or you end up on bottom. And again, if you want to look at another example of that, Nate Diaz Conor, you see he attempts the high wrist style guillotine. Conor has to roll and he concedes bottom position, which ultimately leads to him getting finished. But yeah, massive plug to Mike Malott for the very, very advanced level of guillotine. So obviously we had the Charles Oliveira, he gets the win here against Dariush. On the next card is one of the other guys in the lightweight division that really no one wants to fight, that gave Islam Makhachev one of his toughest fights ever. Arman Tsarukyan is on the next UFC. I believe the next UFC is Cannonier versus Marvin Vettori, but Tsarukyan's going to be the co-main. Tsarukyan's a guy that's very underappreciated. He's probably, realistically, technically top 3 in that division easily. We really don't know how good he is because none of the elite level guys really will take fights against him. He had one of the closest fights against Mateus Gamrot, but again, since then he's really had trouble finding opponents, and I think he's very, obviously, yeah, he's not a massive name, so he's not going to get too many fights against guys like Poirier, Gaethje, or even McGregor for that matter, but I think this guy's one of the biggest threats to the title in the lightweight division if he can ultimately get an opponent that'll agree to fight him, that'll put him in a position to get a title shot. But yeah, that could be an interesting one for Dariush. Dariush next fight, if Sarukian wins his fight at the next UFC, be cool to see how they match up against each other. I think Dariush could have the answer to some of the grappling problems that Sarukian presents. But again, I think Sarukian against any of these guys in that top 5 is going to be a massive challenge for those guys fighting against Sarukian. I don't blame them for not wanting to take on one of the most talented, unknown fighters in lightweight, so definitely keep an eye out for Sarukian at the next UFC event. Guys, like and subscribe. Check out the latest El Segundo podcast we did with Izzy, or if you want one that's pure banter and harassment of the community, check out the previous one I did solo with Freddie. Ultimately, we're going to have some big MMA guests on there, and I'm excited to shoot the shit with those guys, so please like and subscribe.